The explosion rattled the rusty slave ship, sending Bob crashing through a corridor choked with smoke. His eyes, sharp as a seagull scoping out dropped fries, scanned the dingy holding area. Rows of cages lined the walls, most empty, except for one. In that cage sat a woman. But she wasn't just any woman. No, she was blue. Like really blue. Her skin was the color of a blueberry smoothie. And her physique? Well, it looked like she'd been hand-sculpted by some galactic artist. But it was her eyes that really got him. Defiant, fierce, and hiding a storm of, well, probably not joy. Bob wasn't great with emotions, but even he could tell she wasn't thrilled to be there. Fresh scratches marked the bars of her cage, and her knuckles were bloodied. She was trembling slightly. Bob raised an eyebrow. "So, you tried to bust out of here recently, huh?" The woman's eyes widened. "How did you—" "No time." Bob cut her off with a wave, already fiddling with the lock. "Name's Bob. Let's get you out before we both end up in a place where the only vacation is permanent." The cage creaked open, and she hesitated, eyeing him with suspicion. "You're awfully quick to the rescue. You're awfully strong for someone stuck in a cage," Bob replied, noting her well-toned arms. "And we're going to need that muscle. Now move it." She stood, moving with the grace of a gymnast who hadn't had to flip in a while. "Name's Zora." "Right, Zora. Stay close and stay quiet." Bob motioned her to follow, already creeping down the corridor like a man who knew way too much about sneaking through evil layers. As they snuck through the ship, Bob's eyes darted around like a caffeinated ferret. He pointed out worn patches on the floor and hidden security cameras like he was showing Zora around a particularly sketchy museum. 3 cameras up ahead. We got a 12-second window to sprint through before we're on space TV. You ready? Zora blinked. How do you know all this? Bob's lips quirked in a humorless smirk. I have eyes, ears, and a little thing called paranoia. They darted across the hallway, and Zora's breath came in sharp gasps by the time they made it. Seriously, who are you? A guy who knows what it's like to be a walking price tag, Bob said, his voice grim. Now, sho. Guard coming. Sure enough, the clomp of boots echoed. Bob didn't waste any time. With a move quicker than you could say poor life choices, he lunged at the guard, grabbed his throat, and twisted. The guard dropped like a sack of space potatoes. Zora stared. Wow, you're disturbingly good at this. Bob shrugged. You either get good at this stuff, or you get real bad at breathing. They made their way to the escape pods, Bob dispatching guards with the grace of a dancer who'd swapped ballet slippers for headlocks. Zora couldn't help but admire the way he seemed to know exactly where to punch, kick, or throw someone without breaking a sweat. Just as they reached the escape pod bay, alarms blared. Bob gritted his teeth. They've noticed you're missing. We got 3 minutes before things get real ugly. He punched in the launch codes, the pod door hissing open. Zora hesitated. Something's not right, she said, her blue skin pale with anxiety. Tell me about it, Bob muttered. Security's way too lax. It's like someone wants us to escape. Before she could reply, another explosion rocked the ship. Bob shoved her into the pod, slamming the launch button. As they hurtled into space, the slave ship exploded behind them. Okay, Zora said, her voice shaky. What just happened? Bob's eyes narrowed. Someone else wanted that ship blown to bits. Someone with more juice than us. He turned to her, his gaze scrutinizing her like she was the last slice of pizza. So, what's your deal, exactly? Because you're not just some random prisoner, are you? Zora's face fell. I don't know. My family, they sold me. Said it was for the good of our people. Her voice cracked slightly. I never understood why. Bob nodded slowly. Political shenanigans, galactic backstabbing. You were a pawn, kid. Zora's eyes flashed with renewed defiance. Not anymore. Bob allowed himself a small smile. That's the spirit. Now, let's get somewhere safe. I know a place on Zeta 9. Not exactly the Ritz, but it'll do. Zora smirked. After that cage, anything sounds like paradise. Bob chuckled, a sound that surprised even him. Fair enough, but don't get too comfy. We're going to be hunted. Zora raised an eyebrow. You don't have to stick around, you know. You've done more than enough. Bob's face hardened. I don't do half-finished jobs. Zora studied him, curiosity outweighing caution. Why'd you save me? You don't know me. You don't know me anything. Bob was silent for a moment, his eyes distant. Because a long time ago, someone saved me, and I figured it was time I returned the favor. The vulnerability in his words made Zora pause. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Thank you, she said softly. Bob cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the whole feelings thing. Yeah, well, don't thank me yet. We've still got to figure out who wants you bad enough to blow up a whole ship. Zora leaned back, smiling faintly. At least the company's entertaining. Entertaining gets you killed, Bob muttered. Boring means survival. I like boring. She grinned. And yet here you are, rescuing random blue ladies and making enemies. Bob sighed. Touché. As the pod entered hyperspace, Zora glanced over at Bob. You said you noticed things. So, what do you notice about me? Bob gave her a quick once-over. You come from money, but you've never had to lift a finger before. Those calluses are new from fighting in that cage. You're smart, educated, but you've got a rebellious streak. Also, you're angry, scared, and curious. Really curious. Zora blinked, impressed and a little unnerved. You got all that just from looking at me? Bob shrugged. I pay attention. Zora smirked. And what do I notice about you? Bob grinned. That I'm doing my best to pretend I haven't noticed how ridiculously attractive you are. Zora blushed a deeper shade of blue. Wasn't what I meant. Bob laughed. Right? Well, buckle up. Things are about to get real interesting. The pod hummed as it streaked through hyperspace, the soft blue glow of the swirling stars outside, casting an eerie light inside the cramped cabin. Zora had managed to catch a little rest. But Bob? He was still at the console, eyes darting between screens and readouts like he was waiting for the ship to pop out of a birthday cake with lasers. Zora stirred and sat up, wincing as a sore muscle protested. You didn't sleep at all, did you? Bob gave a grunt, which was probably the closest thing to an answer she was going to get. We're coming up on Zeta 9. Get ready for a bumpy landing. Again. Zora stretched, rubbing her neck. If you know it's going to be bumpy, maybe you could, not make it that way. Bob glanced at her with a smirk. I could, but then how would I keep you on your toes? Ever considered piloting lessons? Once, Bob replied, but I was too busy dodging laser fire to take the class. Zora shook her head with a grin. You really need a hobby. I have one, Bob said. It's called surviving. As they dropped out of hyperspace, Zeta 9 loomed ahead of them, a small, desolate planet that looked like it hadn't had a good day in a millennium. Two suns beat down on the barren, rocky surface, and from what Zora could see, there was nothing but sand, dust, and the occasional boulder. It was like someone had dumped a galactic litter box and forgotten about it. Home sweet home, Bob muttered, eyes glued to the controls. Charming, Zora replied. Let me guess, no swimming pools? Depends how you feel about quicksand. The pod broke through the atmosphere, the ride as bumpy as promised. Zora braced herself as they hit turbulence. Bob was wrestling the controls, the pod lurching and rattling like it was about to come apart. I thought you said this thing was in one piece. Zora shouted over the noise. I said it landed in one piece. Didn't say it'd stay that way, Bob replied, giving the yoke a sharp twist as they barely avoided a jagged outcropping of rock. The pod skidded across the sand, kicking up a plume of dust, before finally coming to a bone-rattling stop. Zora exhaled, grateful to still be in one piece herself. Remind me never to let you drive again. Bob shrugged. Next time, you can fly us into a planetary dust storm. The hatch hissed open, and a wave of scorching heat blasted into the cabin. Zora shielded her eyes from the twin suns, squinting out at the barren landscape. So, where's this abandoned outpost? Bob pointed off into the distance. 2 clicks that way, just over the dunes. Zora groaned. Of course it is. They grabbed what little gear they had, a couple of blasters, some rations, and a medkit, and started trekking across the sand. The heat was oppressive, and Zora could feel it seeping into her bones, making her skin prickle uncomfortably. Do people actually live here? She asked, wiping sweat from her brow. Used to, Bob replied, scanning the horizon. Mining colony long abandoned. Now, it's just a good place to disappear. Disappear? Zora raised an eyebrow. And who exactly are we disappearing from? Bob kept walking, eyes forward. Take your pick, slavers, bounty hunters, possibly whoever blew up that ship. You've got a lot of fans, Zora. Not sure why yet, but I'm guessing you're not exactly running for Galactic Prom Queen. Zora sighed. Great. And here I thought being sold into slavery would be the low point of my week. Cheer up, Bob said deadpan. Maybe we'll get lucky, and they'll just send assassins instead of bounty hunters. Always the optimist. They trudged in silence for a while, the twin suns beating down on them like they'd personally insulted the weather. Finally, they crested a large dune, and the outpost came into view. It was as dilapidated as Zora expected. Rusted metal structures, half buried in sand, with a couple of crooked antennae that looked like they hadn't picked up a signal since the planet's glory days. Wow, she said. If I squint, I can almost see the five-star resort. Bob ignored the sarcasm and led the way down to the outpost. The doors to one of the larger buildings creaked open with a groan, revealing a dim, dusty interior. The place had clearly been ransacked at some point. Old crates were overturned, bits of equipment lay scattered across the floor, and there were scorch marks on the walls. Nice, Zora muttered. Really cozy. It'll do, Bob said, already scanning the room for anything useful. He picked up a rusty pipe, gave it a quick swing, and nodded. Could use this as a weapon. Or as tetanus. Bob didn't reply. He was too busy checking the security of the doors and peering through the grimy windows. After a few moments, he seemed satisfied that they were alone, for now. Zora slumped onto a dusty crate, fanning herself with her hand. So, what now? We just sit here and hope nobody comes looking for us? Bob crouched down, fiddling with some old wiring on the floor. We lay low, keep our heads down, and figure out why everyone in the galaxy seems so interested in you. Maybe they're just jealous of my blue complexion. Sure, that's probably it. Bob's tone was dry as sand. Or it has something to do with your family. You said they sold you, right? Zora sighed. Yeah, and I still don't get why. One minute I'm living a nice, privileged life on Europa 5. The next I'm in a cage being shipped off like cargo. My parents said it was for the good of our people, whatever that means. Bob gave her a look. If they sold you, it means you're valuable. Probably in a way that benefits someone else. Zora frowned. Great. I'm a walking commodity. Join the club, Bob muttered. He was still fiddling with the wiring, connecting a few loose ends. Do you ever stop tinkering with things? She asked, watching him. Bob glanced up with a smirk. When there's nothing left to tinker with. Suddenly, the old comm system in the outpost crackled to life. Zora jumped, startled by the sound. Bob frowned and leaned in closer to the crackling speaker. Well, that's not good, he muttered. What? What's not good? Bob tapped the side of the comm unit, which crackled again before falling silent. Someone's nearby. Someone with a ship, and they're using the old mining frequencies. Zora's eyes widened. Bounty hunters? Bob's expression turned grim. Either that or door-to-door salesman. And I'm not buying. Before Zora could respond, the unmistakable roar of engines echoed through the air outside. Dust began to swirl as two ships, sleek, black, and clearly armed to the teeth, descended from the sky, circling the outpost like vultures. Bob grabbed his blaster and tossed one to Zora. Looks like we got company. Time to see just how valuable you really are. Zora gulped, her heart pounding as the ships landed, kicking up a cloud of sand. Any brilliant plans? She asked, gripping the blaster tightly. Bob gave her a tight smile. Yeah, don't die. As the first bounty hunters stepped out of their ships, armed and ready, Zora felt a rush of adrenaline. It was about to get ugly, but at least it wouldn't be boring. The low hum of the ship's engines filled the air, mixing with the sharp sting of blowing sand. Zora gripped her blaster, so tightly her fingers hurt, her heart pounding in her chest. Bob stood beside her, eyes narrowed as the bounty hunters fanned out, clearly experienced, methodical, and not in the mood for conversation. How many? Zora whispered. 4, 5 tops, Bob replied. not taking his eyes off the approaching figures. Could be more in the ships. Either way, it's about to get interesting. Zora glanced nervously at the blaster in her hand. You do realize I've never shot one of these before, right? Bob shot her a quick, incredulous look. What were you doing in that cage? Knitting. Hey, Zora hissed back. I was busy not dying. Thank you very much. Shooting wasn't part of the curriculum. Well, consider this your crash course, Bob said, eyes fixed ahead. Point, aim, shoot, preferably in that order. Before she could respond, a voice rang out from the lead bounty hunter, a hulking man with more armor than sense. He held up a hand as his squad stopped about 50 feet away, clearly assessing the situation. You two, step out with your hands up, and we might let you walk away from this. Bob glanced at Zora. You feel like walking? Zora shook her head, trying to ignore the dryness in her throat. Not particularly. Good. Stay close to me. Bob stepped forward, his blaster ready, but still down at his side, as if he wasn't impressed by the bounty hunters bearing down on them. The lead hunter took a step closer, his helmeted face reflecting the harsh sunlight. I'm only asking once. The girl comes with us, and you, whoever you are, don't have to die today. Bob scratched his chin thoughtfully. Tempting offer. But how about this? You turn around, get back on your fancy ships, and we'll call it a day. The bounty hunter laughed, a deep, unpleasant sound that made Zora's skin crawl. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But we've got orders and a lot of credits riding on this one. Zora could see Bob's eyes scanning the group, sizing them up, calculating. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Bob raised his blaster just a fraction, his voice casual. All right, well, if you're set on dying today, I guess that's your business. Before the lead hunter could reply, Bob fired. The shot was quick and precise, hitting the hunter square in the chest. He staggered back, more surprised than hurt, but it was enough to spark chaos. The other hunters sprang into action, firing back as they spread out across the sand. Stay low, Bob barked, ducking behind a rusted-out crate. Zora dropped down beside him, her heart racing. She peeked over the crate, watching his blaster fire crisscross the air. Bob popped up, fired off a couple of shots, and then ducked back down as return fire whizzed overhead. What do we do now? She asked, gripping her blaster like it was a lifeline. We fight, Bob replied simply. Try to keep up. He leapt over the crate, firing as he moved, his fluid, almost unnatural movements keeping him one step ahead of the hunter's shots. Zora stared in disbelief. How did he make it look so easy? Taking a deep breath, she raised her blaster, aimed at one of the hunters who was flanking their position, and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, about 10 feet wide, but at least it made the hunter duck. Nice try, Bob called over his shoulder. Now hit something. Zora gritted her teeth and tried again, this time managing to clip the edge of the hunter's leg. He yelped and went down, scrambling to take cover behind a rock. Better, Bob shouted. But we've got more company. Zora turned to see what he meant, and her stomach dropped. Another ship was descending from the sky, sleek and black like the others, but this one was twice the size. A bad sign if she'd ever seen one. Bob, I see it, he growled, taking down another hunter with a quick shot to the shoulder. Keep moving, Zora. They were getting pinned down, and she could feel it. The bounty hunters were good, too good, and they were closing in. As much as Bob fought, he couldn't hold them off forever. Zora ducked behind another crate, breathing hard, trying to calm the panic rising in her chest. This is not good, Bob. This is really not good. Understatement of the year, Bob muttered, glancing at the new ship as it landed with a heavy thud, its engines kicking up a storm of dust. The hatch opened, and out stepped a figure Zora definitely didn't expect to see. A woman, tall, lean, and dressed head to toe in what could only be described as the latest fashion in space evil chic, strolled down the ramp. Her hair was sleek, silver, and styled like she had all the time in the galaxy for a good blowout. Her eyes were cold, sharp, and way too pleased with herself. Zora, Bob muttered, his tone low. Stay behind me. The woman stopped in front of the bounty hunters, surveying the scene with a smile that made Zora's blood run cold. You really thought you could run? She called out, her voice ringing through the air like a death knell. You think you can hide from me? Bob's jaw tightened. Who the hell is that? Zora swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her name's Dalia. She's the one who sold me. Dalia's eyes locked onto Zora, like a predator spotting its prey. Oh, there you are, darling. I was beginning to think these idiots had lost you. Bob stepped in front of Zora, his blaster raised. She's not going anywhere with you. Dalia laughed, the sound icy and condescending. You must be Bob. I've heard so much about you. The man who thinks he can save every broken thing in the galaxy. She gave him a pitying look. But this one? This one isn't for saving. She's property. Zora's fists clenched, anger boiling up in her chest. I'm not your property. Dalia tilted her head, mockingly. Oh, but you are, dear. And I think it's time you remembered your place. Before Zora could respond, Bob fired, straight at Dalia's heart. But she didn't flinch. In a blur of motion, Dalia raised her hand, and the blaster bolt froze midair, suspended like it was stuck in time. Zora's breath caught. What the? Dalia flicked her wrist, and the bolt shot off into the distance, harmless. She smirked at Bob. I'm afraid I'm not as easily dealt with as my hired help. Bob growled, backing up slightly. Zora, run. Zora shook her head. Not without you. Dalia's grin widened. Oh, how touching. But you won't get far. Not this time. Before either of them could react, the air around them crackled with energy. Bob and Zora barely had time to look at each other before the ground beneath them erupted, throwing them both backwards. Zora hit the sand hard, her vision swimming. The last thing she saw before everything went black was Dalia's cold, triumphant smile as she approached. And then darkness.